racism in America? All right, tonight I'm going to start the conversation with a question that I believe is a relevant question. And in just a moment, when I ask the question, I'm going to ask the panelists to, before they answer the question, to share with us what they do. We have some outstanding interfaith clergy and persons who are very outspoken in their religious traditions, and I believe what they have to say is quite necessary. All right, I'm going to start tonight with Rabbi Jeff Arnowitz. I'm going to ask him the question, what is racism? This is a question for everybody, and I'm going to ask them to keep their answers short because we got a lot of stuff that we want to ask them. But we'll start with Rabbi. Would you tell us where you are serving? And then we'll go to another person on the panel.
Sure. Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be here with all of you tonight. I serve as the senior rabbi at the Westchester Jewish Center in Marinette, New York. And as a definition of racism, I think racism is a system of power. It's a construct used to have one group, in this case, white people, have power and authority and control over another group of people, Black people. I think it's a false construct. There's nothing biological to it, but it is a very real construct in that it's extremely acculturated, and we are all part of it, whether we realize it or not.
Thank you, Rabbi. Aida?
Hi, Assalamu alaikum, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulullah. My name is Aida Mackic. I am currently serving as the Public Relations Liaison at Islamic Society of Tampa Bay here in Tampa, Florida. Thank you for having me on this panel, and thank you to all the panelists that are here today. What is racism? I think Rabbi defined it in a very simplistic way. As to say it is one white supremacy or one dominant power over another. But it's also a word that is widely used and carries many different meanings depending on who's using it, right? And if we want to work together effectively for racial justice, and we do, we need to really delve into what systemic racism is and how it operates here in this country in particular. And we do have to take it from a religious standpoint, but also cultural standpoint and what we bring to the table. So that's for me. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your contribution. Norman?
Hi, good evening. I am Norman Harris. I'm the owner of Champions for Justice Law in Tampa, Florida. Also ordained itinerant elder in the non-denominational Christian tradition. I'm very, very, very excited about being here tonight and having this discussion with my Muslim and Jewish brothers and sisters. We are all children of Abraham. So it's good to be here tonight. What is racism? I think Webster would essentially define it as a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Now, what that looks like in America is the white alleged race, which I agree with Rabbi Jeff. It really is, this whole concept of race is a social, political construct. And as it has played out in America, the white has put upon themselves the position of superiority, and blacks and other minorities have been labeled as just that, the minority group. And it has resulted in about 246 years of slavery from 619 to 1865, followed by about 19 years of Jim Crow from 1865 to 1964, till about another 52 years of redlining, mass incarceration, police brutality, disparities in education and economics, and so forth, so on, from 1968 even until now. And I can go on, but I know Brother Jarvis is waiting to answer the question.
Thank you so much for your answer. Well, now, Jarvis, El-Amin.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Harris, for inviting me to this panel. Thank you, my dear friend, Brother Norma, for thinking and not Robert to invite me to be on the panel. Jarvis El-Amin, I'm a member organization of African American Muslim Alliance of Tampa Bay. Also, I'm the vice chair of a local community mosque called Masjid Al-Nasser, Masjid to Help. So it's an outreach mosque that do outreach in the community. And also I've been involved in political and community activism for over 40 years in between South Georgia, Florida, and Miami in South Florida and Tampa Bay area. Let's talk about racism. Really, I'm glad I came last because all of the panels gave good definitions of what racism is. But when you start talking about racism, you're talking about prejudice, discrimination, directed toward particularly Black people. Let's just keep it real, particularly toward Black people, and then to marginalize people. And you can't be a racist unless you got power. So when they call, there's no such thing as somebody else being a racist because they ain't got no power. They don't have the power to tell a person they can't go here, can't do this. They don't control the systems that perpetrate this kind of racism. And so when you talk about racism, it's a system that gives the so-called racists power to marginalize a people that they feel that they are superior than.
Thank you so much. Rabbi Ross?
You weren't quite the last, almost the last, right? Really, all of the things that I would have said have been said already. I'm Rabbi Ross Mandelberg. I'm the rabbi of Old Shalom Temple, and I'm in Norfolk, Virginia, and I've been a rabbi for 25 years. Maybe I can go first on the next question, because I don't really have anything to add.
That's exactly what I was going to do.
Okay.
Great. The next question is, tradition is preserved through institutional symbolisms and rituals. How is racism preserved? And Rabbi, in your answer to the question, if you feel free to draw in any of, I know a little bit about your family history, and so and feel free to share with us from your heart about this issue of symbolism and how that might preserve racism.
Sure. So it's an interesting question. You said traditions preserved through institutional symbolism and rituals. Well, so is racism. Mm-hmm. The monuments are a perfect example, but there are so many ways in which racism is preserved, as has been said, through history, generationally passed down, systemically in law, in culture. It's perpetuated economically, as was said, that it's very hard to get people to willingly give up what they think is theirs and hold fast to, even if it means that others are not enjoying their share of God's bounty, which is essentially what's happening with people of color in our nation. I think what Antipas is referring to is, I'm a child of a Holocaust survivor. So I understand what it is to be oppressed, to be violated, even to be murdered for who you are. But I have learned more recently than I would like to say that although anti-Semitism is a horrible evil, it's not the same horrible evil as racism. Because as a white Jewish woman, I still enjoy white privilege. I can still pass, whereas a person of color cannot. Yes, I lost my entire family, or most of it, in the Holocaust, and we have to work against that evil as well. But I think this moment in history is the time to work against racism against people of color.
Yes. So, Rabbi Ross, I appreciate that. I can't help but think how deeply just the concept of symbols really is entrenched within the Jewish tradition. The symbolisms, and the symbolisms of anti-Semitism in Germany during Nazi Germany, how those symbolisms evoked ideologies that are anti-Semitic, like the swastika.
Yes.
Right? And when I think about the meaning of symbolism within the Jewish tradition, and the assault and the insult of symbolisms within Nazi Germany, and I have a weird way of thinking reflected upon, say, the Confederate flags here in this country, and it seems to me that there might be a insight, theological insight, that the rabbis and others, Muslims as well, may be able to shed on the meaning of these symbols and how they impact and perpetuate the thing that they stood for. Can you give me a little bit of thought on that, Rabbi Rosa?
Well, obviously, I think that the symbols are incredibly charged, with memory, with power, with meaning. And when they continue to be used, I think they serve to terrorize people who've been victimized by them. Like the the swastikas are like the Confederate monuments. They sit on locations where human beings were sold into, as slaves. And similarly, obviously, the swastika was used to enslave not just the Jews of Europe, but certainly the Jews of Europe during World War II. But they're extremely important. And one of the things that I'm coming to realize is not everybody understands the history of those symbols and behind them. And we need to do a better job of educating them of what those symbols mean and why they are so terrible and destructive and painful for others.
Yeah, thank you for your insight.
Can I add a quick thought to that?
Yes, please.
I agree 100% with what my friend and colleague Rabbi Raz said. I just want to add also, symbols are incredibly powerful and also really easily manipulated. So if you take the Nazi swastika, it started out as a completely different symbol somewhere, in Central Asia, as I understand it. By the way, not an expert in that symbology, nor do I particularly want to be, but then was manipulated and changed to represent the evil that it did. And symbols can also be changed again. The evil never goes away, but it becomes hidden by other code words. I think a lot of what's happened now is that the symbols that people used to know what they stood for, they still know what they stand for, they used to be able to say what they stood for, have now been encoded language to be talked about in other ways. So, we look at Confederate flags, and actually just before we came on, I think the Mississippi State House voted the Confederate flag off of its state flag, which is a victory. But again, it's just a symbolic victory.
Yes.
It's good. Nobody's got to look at that flag and see that what is a cruel and awful symbol for so many people. But also, that's just a step. What's underlying that symbol still manifests in other ways in the society. So it's good to address the symbols and to say what they really mean and to teach the history of them, as Rabbi Raz said, and not to make excuses and apologetics for them. But also, it's got to go beyond the symbols. Other symbols will crop up if we're not careful and we don't do the education, the teaching, the active work against what those symbols have meant.
Others who might have a reaction?
Yes.
Aida?
Yeah, let me jump in. I'd like to jump in on that. This is Jarvis El-Amin.
Yeah.
What's interesting about that distinguished panel is that the biggest terrorist group in the world is the Ku Klux Klan. And they was using the American flag to burning our ancestors' yard, in addition to the Confederate, the rebel flag, when they was terrorizing and black people. And so, you know, it's amazing to me that the symbol of the flag have not, in a lot of cases, I know this is real tough, but it's the truth, have not represented freedom for us. It represents scars and stripes. And you know, so hasn't been a real thing, because if we was truly had our human rights, we won't have to be out here marching for civil rights. And so no other people that came to this country have to be given civil rights. So what we have to be very cautious that Almighty God gave all us human rights as a human being, to be respected as a human being. And so that's where it started at. And so that's why in our tradition,
I also would like to add,
you know, go ahead.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I apologize.
Yes, please.
Yeah, just a simple point, actually, to everything that my colleagues on the panel have said, but I also would like to highlight how education plays into this as well. And that's a very powerful component here, how history is being taught in our schools, right? From a particular type of lens that has an impact on how these symbols are perceived as well. And if we are not teaching history in a particular way, right, then certain communities and certain people may have a convoluted reason into accepting how these symbols play a part in our society, right? So I think education is a very important part that we should also address in terms of how we are teaching our children, how the schools are providing resources on particular events throughout our history, right? Slavery, Confederates, and the leaders that we have, monuments, and what it actually stands for. And I think that if there was more of an effort into providing these educational resources to our communities, there would be a clear understanding of what these symbols mean and the hurt that they instill in our society.
Great point, because these, in American history, Black history is usually marginalized, and many times it's shoved for Black people to learn, as if Black history is for Black people, when Black history is American history. In fact, recently there was a gentleman, I was on a panel, and the moderator, I mentioned the Tulsa race riots, and he said, I have a history degree, and I never knew about the Tulsa race riots.
Right.
And I said, well, your school failed you, because that is exactly what you're saying, is that Tulsa race riots is part, Rosewood is a part of American history. The many times that police have bombed the Black community in the history of this country is part of American history. The KKK is part of American history. Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, the list goes on. This is American history that has been ghettoized and ascribed to the Black community, and usually really talked about in February. And it's for us, by us. And then we have a breakfast and everybody else shows up. But for the most part, a lot of what's going on, the broader American society, is there needs to be an awakening. And in some ways, we're having an awakening. And people are asking questions about things that seem so obvious to me. But because America has never, Black life in America has just never mattered. And so Black Lives Matter is not just a thing to say. Black life has never mattered, because we weren't brought here to matter. We brought here for economics and to build the country. And as you said, Brother El-Amin, you said that, basically there's been assault on Black life all along, and even the KKK used the American flag to do it. So the point is that we have to have a clear awakening in all of American society to realize that this is our problem, not their problem.
Let me just add something real quick before you go to Norma.
Yes.
I just want to say, first of all, when you think about the Confederate monuments, they was placing these monuments right in the so-called halls of justice. So you come into a courthouse thinking you're gonna get justice, you walking through some Confederate generals who had slaves and who was a racist, who hated the very sight of a Black person. How would you ever get some justice in this hall? So those symbolism of taking monuments down, you got people that say it don't mean nothing. It does mean something, because it represents slavery, oppression, and the likes of. And in our faith, it says that slaughter is better than oppression. That's what Muhammad the Prophet says. So it's better for just outright kill me than oppress me.
Wow. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I could chime in on that. The irony is we're in part having a conversation about parts of Black history not being incorporated into the educational system as American history. But on the other hand, there is a strong fight to preserve the Confederate monuments and flag and things of that nature, supported by an argument that that's a part of American history, although this Confederate business only lasted 5 years or so. It's not really a significant part of the history in terms of time. But I think while we speak about symbolisms and how symbolisms help preserve tradition, I think all of us as members of faith communities know from a positive perspective how important symbolisms are in terms of preserving tradition. Now, on the dark side, we find the same thing. And with respect to the Confederate flag and the Confederate monuments and things of that nature, that's on the dark side. But the impact of those symbols in terms of preservation is the same. And if the truth be told, that's where the real fight comes from, because that preserves a tradition of white supremacy. Now there are false narratives being fabricated to support that, and let's just pull the rug here. The Civil War ended in 1863. Mm-hmm. Well, if this was really about a preservation of history in terms of honoring those that died fighting with the Confederate Army, you would think that would have been a tradition that was started right after the war. But no. You check real history, you will see that started around 1889. Why? Well, because between the time that the Civil War ended in 1863 and 1889, what happened? We had the Reconstruction era. And what happened in that era? The 13th Amendment, abolishment of slavery, the 14th Amendment, establishing citizenship for Blacks and due process, the 15th Amendment, establishing voters' right, not denial of voting rights based on race. And so this was a period where Blacks in America had begun to come up. And when the white supremacists saw this, that's when the idea of Confederate flag and monuments came about to preserve white supremacy, when it looked like there was a point in time in history when Blacks would come up. Okay, fast forward. There was a resurgence of this around the 1940s, 1950s. Why? When the Blacks had started, gearing up with the civil rights thing. So once again, this Confederate stuff reared its ugly head to preserve white supremacy. And I'll say this and I'll be done. I came across, let me find it here. I came across a quote that was made by a gentleman named Roy Harris. He was an editor of Augusta Courier in 1951. This is what he wrote. And this is this type of thing that you're not going to find in a history book. It says, quote, "The Confederate flag is coming to mean something to everybody now. It means the Southern cause. It means the heartthrobs of the people of the South. It is becoming to be the symbol of the white race and the cause of the white people. The Confederate flag means segregation." Unquote. I'll just let that sit and I'll be quiet for a second.
Don't be so passionate. Be a little bit more calm. No, just kidding.
Can I say something about that?
Please.
I think I want to say something as a white guy on the panel. I think that a lot of white people don't understand when you say white supremacy, what that means. And I apologize to anyone who does and finds that I'm being, pedantic or talking down, but I'm going to say it anyway, because it's something I've been coming to grips with and coming to understand much more more recently than I'd like to admit, but that's the reality. I think we think of white supremacists and we think of, you know, some person who hates another person based on their race, which is, by the way, a white supremacist. But when we talk, I think, and correct me if I misspeak, Brother Norman, I don't mean to misspeak, but when we talk about white supremacy in this context, we're talking about a culture of white supremacy. We're talking about an entire society that is built around an idea that's just been planted in all of us from a very, very young age, that being white is better than being black. And it's everywhere. It's insidious, right? From the conversation that Aida and Antipas were having about education. You know, why is that we teach all of American history from a white perspective? Why is it the authors we read are white authors, except on Black History Month, when we might read, you know, some Black authors and so on and so forth. And it's not just in that, it's in the hospitals, it's in healthcare, it's in the neighborhoods. It's, you know, when we say, oh, this neighborhood is a good neighborhood, or this good neighborhood is a bad neighborhood, it's having that coded language that usually means, it means there's Black and brown people there if it's a bad neighborhood. It's going in, oh, it's going in a bad direction. People know what the coded language, because they don't want to, you know, if you call it out, that's no good. So this white supremacy is something that I think we all have to get a little more understanding of the language. It's important language. I think it's triggering for white people, and I think it's a good thing, because I think we have a lot to think about. This is not a Black problem. It's a white problem. It's something that we are perpetuating, not on purpose, for most of us, some people on purpose, a lot of us not on purpose. And so we don't think it applies to us. You say, oh, I'm a progressive, whatever, you know, it doesn't, but it does until we actively start working against it. So just in case anyone heard that language and shut off and said, well, I'm not a white supremacist, so I don't need to listen to this anymore. That trigger, that switch, I am learning. I'm starting to learn. And like I said, I wish I'd learned it earlier. That is the system itself in our head telling us to perpetuate it. This doesn't apply to me. So I just wanted to clarify that, because I think it's a very, very important term that we all need to come to understand a little bit better if we did not already.
Right. And
I think Aida wants to speak. Yes.
I actually wanted to add, Rabbi Jeffrey, perfect point. And I cannot agree more with you on this subject matter. And I think it's extremely important in our faith institutions, right, whether that is a mosque, synagogue, church, temple, etc., that we talk about racism within our own institutions. I think that this cannot be off the table. I think in our faith, what our faith teaches us, you start within your own family, you then delve into your own community, and then you work your way out. And it's called the Sunnah way of approaching things, right? And I think when Brother Jarvis and I spoke about this earlier today, it's very important that we highlight what the clergy, what faith institutions, it is a duty of ours, right? It is something that it is taught within our scriptures that we have to talk about. We have to be very vulnerable about. We have to be uncomfortable in these conversations. And we have to allow these topics within that uncomfort to simmer and sit with us and say, okay, we have to recognize how it is being applied here as well. And are we there, right? To ask our question is like, are we there? Have we met these? Can we honestly say that, you know, these conversations are being had in faith institutions on a very honest and vulnerable level? And again, starting within ourselves, within our whole family structure, and then our, you know, mosques, churches, etc., and then working our way into the community. And yeah, I think we all have a lot to unpack in terms of those conversations being had.
And I was just going to add, I think when you talk about racism being a white problem, I couldn't agree more. I don't think white America has ever dealt with the legacy of slavery or with the racism that caused it and that has continued to ensue from it. I just give you an example. I offered a year-long course, basically a reading and discussion course on issues of race, of white privilege, of the difference between not being a racist and being an anti-racist, etc. 1 out of every 7 households in my congregation signed on. 1 out of every 7 households, because we all recognize that we're complicit and we're ignorant, and it can't be off the table, and they know it's going to be uncomfortable.
Wow. This is a very, very rich conversation. Yeah. So, other thoughts about that question?
Well, I would chime in to say I could not agree more. And I thank Rabbi Jeffrey for your comments. I'm one who strongly believe when we talk about white supremacy, we're talking about a racist structure that has been preserved through certain symbols and systems. That's why I think it was a great idea to start out with the question about what is racism. I think it kind of laid the platform or the foundation that racism is about power, where one alleged race, because I believe really that there's one real race, the human race, but through political and social, and unfortunately in some arenas, religious structures, we've come up with these constructs dealing with race to conquer and divide. But it all goes back to how the country was established on this false notion of race, which sets forth a structure of white supremacy in America. And from that point until now, the symbols and the system have supported it. So when we talk about white supremacy, I'm very glad and wholeheartedly embrace, we're talking about structures, systems, and symbols, and not necessarily individuals. I do believe that one could be a part of a racist system or carrying out the notion of white supremacy without hatred. Because I think the necessary ingredient is the power structure. And if one does not renounce it and take ownership, then that person is a part of it. And we talked a lot about implicit bias. I think implicit bias is a major part of it. That's why it's helpful to become sensitive to cultural norms and be educated on what implicit bias is, because until we become more educated about this thing and be honest and take ownership, I don't think that we could really destroy a system that's not broken but working perfectly for which it was built to. And so I think we need to just destroy that thing and move forward with something more progressive, positive, fair, honest, and what God would have for us to embrace.
I can't believe how rich this conversation is and how time has flown. I want to be able to hear from you, though, on what model should faith communities present to America in response to issues related to social justice or social injustice and racism. Can each of you, maybe if we start with Brother El-Amin?
Yes, I'm glad. I wanted to jump in right as Brother Norman was finishing up, because let me just say this real quick. We really got to deal with racism from the root in terms of the language. Even from that, they start with white supremacy and racism. Black angel food cake is white. You know what I mean? A devil food cake is black. Everything that's associated, black male, black market, black this, it's got to be bad. And so we have constantly tucked that as a norm when we should have been destroying that long time ago. People, they may say people with nappy, kinky hair, that's bad hair. People with straight hair, that's good hair. All of that's part of this white supremacy narrative that they keep going. The model that we have in our religion And I just quote it from the Holy Quran. I won't read it. I just say it. But Allah reveals to us and to humanity, not just to the Muslim, so that he have created us in nations and tribes that we may know each other, not despise each other, not hate each other. It says the most honored of you is one who keep his duty to his God, the one who is most God conscious. So not that I'm a Muslim, not that I'm a Jew, not that I'm a Christian, not that I'm black, not that I'm white, but the most dutiful to God, the one who keep God's duty. And then the prophet left us in his last speech on the mount, and I'll close on this. He says that there's no superiority over black or white, no superior of the Arab and non-Arab. He said the most honor to you is the one who has the most piety to God, the most humility and sincerity to God. So we need to be racing toward civilization, making civilization better. Not no race talking about black and white, but racing toward doing good. So the Quran also says that we should strive as though we're in a race to all that is good. Strive as though we're in a race to all that is good. And so we have to change the narrative and let them know that we have much more in common as the three faith traditions than we have differences, and use our commonality to address racism and other social issues.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Others, Rabbi Ross?
Sure. So the sort of similarly, I think what faith traditions, particularly Judaism, needs to do is to reaffirm that our whole tradition is based on dignity, equality, and justice, that we're all created in the image of God, that our job is to pursue justice, that we must love our neighbor as ourselves, etc. We cannot stand idly by while our neighbor bleeds. And once we recommit to those values, I think then we can ensure that our actions fall in line with them. And then you cannot perpetuate that which is unjust. So I feel like getting back to the root of what our faith tradition teaches us, the Word of God, and then designing a program to work to manifest those values in the world.
Antipas, could you repeat that question?
Yes. What models should faith communities present to America in response to issues related to social injustice and racism? And right now we're saying that the faith communities themselves have enshrined within them theological frameworks that speak to the American social structure and with a correction. So we're saying that whether it's Islam or Judaism, we need to take seriously our own faith tradition and carry those into the public square and speak in a way, in Christian tradition, we would call that prophetically, in a way that people live it out beyond the walls of the confines of their faith.
I could chime in there on that. Was someone else about to speak?
I was asking Ida to chime in.
Oh, okay, go ahead. I'll
Thank you. Norman, if you want to go ahead.
No. Go right ahead. I like learning.
Thank you. I think this is a really good, I like this question. I like this question a lot. I think that we need to look at faith institutions right now. One of the things that I've noticed is a lot of people are leaving faith institutions. Why is that? Have we asked ourselves, why do we have such a gap also in age in our young adults not attending faith institutions and not being active in faith institutions? So it delves into a whole slew of topics, right? But racism is an intrinsic part of this, how this country was formed, right? So it talks about socioeconomic and it talks about every level of our existence, right? So I think it's absolutely paramount that faith institutions do instill some of those values, like the rabbi mentioned earlier, Rabbi Raz, and really live through these values. So for example, in Islam, I mean, I think we can all agree is love thy neighbor and treat thy neighbor as you would yourself, and etc. But are we living these values? Are we teaching our congregation how to live these values. I think that is a very important subject matter, because it's one thing to come to a pulpit and open up our holy book and start preaching from it. But are we literally telling them this is how, giving a guidance, right? This is how we instill it on our everyday life. And I don't want to take up too much time. I know this is an amazing topic, but I also want to emphasize on one of the prophetic sunnahs from our prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and said, when you see an evil, when you see something evil, first thing that was taught to us is that you physically remove that evil, or you try to get away. That is the first thing that you do. And if you cannot do that, if that is going to cause you harm, then you speak on it. You don't then physically do it, but you speak on it actively. And then if you cannot do that, if it's going to cause you harm to speak on it, the least thing you can do then is to pray on it, right? And so when I think of that hadith, that prophetic teaching of our prophet, it really takes me to this time, to this moment of BLM actions happening and awareness that is going on. And I start with my community, right? Because that's the community that I come from. What are we doing to ensure that we are being allies to our Black brothers and sisters here during this moment, in making sure that we're standing with them and being a support, being an ally, right? And so these are just the basic things that I think faith institutions truly need to, one, emphasize on these values, but also give a guidance on how do we now instill these values on a day-to-day occurrence. But yeah,
Fantastic.
go ahead, Brother Norman.
You hit it good.
Let's get to hear from Rabbi Jeffrey, and then we'll go to Norman.
Okay. Is that okay, Norman? I don't want to step
Oh,
on.
absolutely, absolutely.
So I wanted to speak to this from a point of view of an institution in Judaism that we call tshuva. It's repentance, but and I think there's a lot of that needs to go on right now. And the first step of doing tshuva is called cheshbon hanefesh. It's taking an accounting of your soul. I think there's a lot of soul searching that needs to be done right now. A lot of soul searching that's been dodged for way too long. And by the way, one of the issues with this, it seems to me over the last decade or two, there's been a big push towards wanting to be able to say like, oh, race doesn't exist. It's which it doesn't. However, if we say I just see everybody the same, that is also a way not to actually face your own, do you really? Maybe a little more cheshbon hanefesh, because you might say that, but then what happens, when a Black family moves into your neighborhood, or when you're looking at schools and you're looking at populations, or whatever it might be, that's gonna say we can't face our own demons until we do this cheshbon hanefesh. So we really do an honest accounting, ask ourselves hard questions, understand why we react the way we do, so that we can work against them. The next thing to do when we're doing tshuva, when we're coming back to the right path, is we have to figure out how to stop doing what we've been doing. And that is not easy. It's a complex, complicated, deeply entrenched issue, racism. It goes back before the founding of the United States. It's got its own version here, but this is a long. So we have to face like how do you unwind? So, and I'm an optimist, and I'm a believer, and I have faith, and I think it's doable, but it's not going to be easy. Let's not kid ourselves. Like, it's not enough to put a post on social media and say like, hey, I stand with Black people. Like that's that, and then I'll go back to normal. So we have to face down the problem. And third, and I think this is the stickiest, thorniest issue of them all, you have to make good to the people you harmed.
Wow.
So how do we make recompense, right? And I know this is a hard question and a sensitive question, and one, quite frankly, I don't have an answer to, but I know it's a question that comes up and is quickly swatted down a lot. Whether that's reparations or that's an alchei, a mea culpa. I only know Christian and Jewish words for that. Sorry to my my Muslim brothers and sisters. You know, so we have to figure out how do we make this right? It's going to take something. It's going to cost something, but it's something that's owed, because we've certainly benefited an awful lot from this power structure over the last couple of hundreds of years. Maybe not me personally over the last couple of hundred years, maybe not Jews for the last couple of hundred years, but certainly for the last many decades. And we have to have that conversation within our community. And I'm going to figure out what to do. So anyway, I think tshuva is a good model. I think it's time to have a lot of really hard conversations and then take some really difficult actions.
Very good.
Again, great. Now, Norman, this is our last question. You're the last one, so take us home.
Well, I will say that a lot of my thoughts have already been reflected, and Rabbi Jeff basically said a lot of what I was going to say. I was going to say the model, I think, is love. I don't care if you're Christian, Jew, Muslim, whatever. The model that any faith community should present to the world is one of love. And I think love entails quite a few things. And it sounds like now about to echo some things that Rabbi Jeffrey just stated. Repentance. And in the Christian Bible, repentance in the New Testament comes from a Greek word, metanoia, meaning a change of heart. So it's not just a change of practice, but change begins with the heart, which reflects in the practice. Because if you try to change practice without the heart, then your practice will be tainted by implicit bias. But that's probably a whole other conversation. Then you bring forth fruit meat for repentance, which reflects a lot of conversations that we hear about in terms of reparations and whatever that looks like. That's fruit meat for repentance. So you just can't give words of repentance, but you got to show some type of remorse in a tangible way. The Christian faith teaches, how can we say we love a God who's a spirit whom we never physically seen, and hate our brothers and sisters who we physically interact with every day? And the reality is, in the Christian faith, it also teaches to love your neighbor, which means you got to love those who are not even a part of your religious tradition, because we're all neighbors. And so I don't care how we look at it, how we slice it or dice it, faith demands love. I'm going to say this final statement is going to be kind of a strong statement. It's a critique on the Christian faith. I'm a big boy. I don't have to preach in nobody's church to validate. I'm a preacher. So I'm going to say what I got to say.
Come on with it, Norma.
If the Jesus we teach, preach, and claim to follow offends God, that is the wrong Jesus. Because this is one thing we know: God is love. And if the Jesus that we hold up, teach, preach, and follow, I repeat, is a Jesus that offends God, that calls us to treat our brothers, sisters, neighbors wrong, we following the wrong Jesus. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, okay. Well, this has been tremendous. This has absolutely been tremendous. Are there any final words that you'd like to say as we bring this conversation to a close? It has been one power-packed conversation that I would encourage others to share on your page so others can see and hear what the wisdom that is among us tonight. We are privileged. We're privileged to have our esteemed guests, Rabbi Roz Mandelberg, Rabbi Jeff Arnowitz, Aida, Mackic, and Brother El-Amin, and Reverend Norman. Thank you for taking the time out tonight to speak on this very important conversation. And I want you to know, from my heart to yours, you're needed now more than ever. We need you. And when I say we, I'm talking about the whole of humanity needs the faith leaders in profound ways. We cannot look to politicians alone. We cannot look to others in business owners. This is a moral problem. More than a social problem, this is a moral problem that gave rise to a social construct that is profoundly evil. And only a moral voice can speak to a moral problem or an immoral problem. Thank you for your contribution and your wisdom and your passion. Thank you for taking the time out tonight to be a part of this panel. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Antipas. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for inviting us. Exactly.